Hello, YouTube. I am shooting off another response to Thunderbolt 94. But before I get started, I wanted to remark that you may need to calm down a little bit. I'm not sure. It seemed that you were a little upset in the response which I received. I may be reading you incorrectly, but let's get started with some of the points that you raised in your response.
In my opinion, the problem of evil is one of the least compelling arguments against the existence of God. In my view, it's extremely useless.
I'm not attempting to argue against the existence of God, though. I'm not even attempting to do that. I'm just trying to point out that the existence of pain and suffering in the world doesn't necessitate the existence of a God, which to me seemed like a point you were trying to make in your original video.
The problem here is that you are equivocating the God concept with the idea of death, which are two completely different things, two different concepts. For this comparison to even be valid, you have to adjust by what you mean by the term death. Because without defining what you mean by the term death, it makes your statement feel like a false comparison. You neither define the term God nor the term death.
What I mean by death is the cessation of all biological processes, consciousness being one of those. And I don't believe that I was committing an equivocation at all. That would imply that I'm using more than one definition for the same word in the same argument. What I thought I was doing was creating a parallel between the use of the concept of a benevolent God, one which you had already mentioned in the description for your previous video, so I felt that I didn't need to introduce another description as a response to the reality of pain and suffering in the world, creating a parallel with the use of the idea of an afterlife, life after how I've defined death now, as a response to the reality of death. I believe that what I've defined as death is a reality of this universe.
This is the very same point I criticized Professor Anton on.
What Professor Anton video was this? I don't know.
If there's no such thing as death, then it doesn't make sense to say whether or not that life after death exists.
Now that I've defined what I mean by the term death, I should also mention that I see no reason to believe that what I consider to be death doesn't exist.
I think what you're trying to get at is that because some people cannot handle the reality of pain and suffering, they need to believe in some sort of higher power in order to even function. But this point does not show whatsoever that this kind of reliance on a belief, keyword, belief in a higher power is unwarranted in trying to overcome the problem of suffering. I really don't see where you're going with this.
A point which I was attempting to make was not that a belief in a benevolent God in order to try to work on the problem of suffering was unwarranted, but that it is not necessary. And I think that is a point which you were making in your video. You believe that the belief in such a God is necessary in order to attempt to alleviate that problem.
While you are correct that we have come a long way within the last 3,000 years, that does not change the fact that even with the advancement of technology and moving more and more away from different customs and different ways of living, that completely ignores the fact that there is still suffering in this world. There are still wars, famines, genocides, and so on and so on. What does society making progress over the last 3,000 years have to do with this?
I don't think that what I had to say ignores the fact that suffering still exists. I didn't make the claim that suffering can even be eliminated. And what does progress have to do with this? Progress has to do with the decrease in the amount of suffering in the world. That's what I mean by progress. And that is something that we should give ourselves credit for.
Now, if what you're saying is true about mankind coming a long way, then it shouldn't be the case that there will be any suffering, or that the amount of suffering has lessened.
I think a point you're trying to make here is that it is impossible for humans to eliminate suffering. And I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. I think that suffering is an intrinsic quality of the natural world, which we happen to live in, despite our efforts to pretend otherwise. But I do believe that humans are capable of lessening suffering. And I think that at least one indicator of the lessening of suffering is the increased expectancy of life from birth. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, the average lifespan in classical Greece and Rome was 28 years, while the average life expectancy now is over 67 years. I think that's quite an accomplishment, which we should be able to take credit for.
Now, you may argue that there are people who don't believe in God may be able to help alleviate the problem of suffering, and I would argue that you would be correct. But the problem is that how can you be sure that man is able to alleviate the problem without some sort of belief in higher power or belief in a higher power? How do you know that man's reliance on themselves to alleviate the problem of suffering will prevail?
We have no assurance that reliance on ourselves is going to help lessen the amount of suffering in the world at all. There's no certainty there whatsoever. But we have no choice but to rely on ourselves. We cannot count on a benevolent intermediary God to somehow influence human history. We have to do it all ourselves on the assumption that he's not going to do anything.
It does not follow whatsoever that because someone would try and reach out for God for help in a time of pain and suffering, that means they would believe they should be lazy and let God do all the work and believe everything is going to be okay. Because, and according to you, these people believe that the world is going to hell anyway in a handbasket, and Jesus is coming, so we don't have to worry. But you are expressing an extreme minority viewpoint that the majority of Christians, heck, even anyone who believes in a benevolent God, do not hold to.
Unfortunately, that's not the case. I know people personally who believe in a benevolent God, who have this set it and forget it mentality. The point that I was trying to make with bringing this up is that the belief itself can be used as an excuse. And it may be that these kind of people would have this mentality anyway without the belief, but it's used as a justification. That's what I was trying to get out with that. Anyway, I would be interested in any further thoughts you have on this. Peace out.